Okay, so my name is Mark Shobe. I'm working for RBM. So I would just like to share with you the RBM and the IOM experience with the Transhumance Tracking Tool that we call TTT. And I'm just going to use a case study for that. That is the Mali-Mauritania border closure. So, first of all, I would like to make an argument from the field, and that is that in the relationship between pastoralism and conflict, and what we really notice is that data is the most powerful lever we have for prevention. And we are just going to use a concrete case, that is the closure of the Mali-Mauritanian border, and to share it. So let's just start with a simple observation. Across our region, conflicts tend to build where pressure on land, water, and grazing meet climate stress, fast demographic growth, insecurity, and gaps in governance. So our point from the field is this. When we block pastoral mobility, the animals don't disappear, and neither does pressure. So what we just noticed that it just moves somewhere else and taking this tension and the risk with it. So the point here is that pastoral mobility is not a security problem to be suppressed. In fact, it's a resilience mechanism. And the real question is really not how to stop pastoral mobility, but how to anticipate it. And that is the main question about data. So what is delivered since 2019, RBM and IOM have built and deployed what we call the TTT, and that is a real-time platform that monitor pastoral movement and conflict hotspots across the regions. So the scale today speaks for itself. More than 12.7 million head of livestock and 145 transhumant herders have been monitored all along, and over 460 early warning alerts have been issued to support conflict prevention, mitigation, and resolution. So the logic is really simple for us. So we turn movement into information, real-time tracking, concentration, and anticipated tension. And the information really into alerts that allow these actors to act before a crisis, not after it. So that's the real point about that. So let me just show you what this looks like in practice. You have it in this slide. So when the Mauritanian border closed from August 2025, so we mobilized the TTT. And so by cross-referencing TTT data we've surveyed from our member organization and from also our direct field observation, one picture just emerged. Not in there. So one picture just emerged, that is, this was not just a simple border closure. So it was really a regional recomposition of an entire pastoral system. And you can see the numbers between 2.7 and 2.9 million head of livestock, and around 40,000 headers were directly affected by the closure, and more than 80% of that livestock just concentrated on the Mauritanian side alone. And you can conclude, this is a really enormous and sudden pressure on pastoral water points and the capacity of this community to coexist. And to know that this is exactly the condition in which conflict ignites. And the tools show us something just as important. You can see in the map, the mobility did not stop. It just transformed. So it took longer, costlier, and sometimes even more dangerous routes. And entirely new corridors were opened toward eastern Senegal, and mainly in Bakel, Matam, and Tabakunda. So this really matter for prevention because we could follow the pressure as it moved, and we could also flag the territories about to receive it before tension there escalated. And like we said, pressure never disappear. It just move and recompose. And data is what let us really see it coming. So from this observation, there is three lessons from this case. The first lesson is that pastoral mobility is a resilient solution, not really a security problem. When you block it and just conflict will risk will rise instead of falling. So the second lesson that we can just draw from this case study is that conflict linked to mobility can no longer be anticipated without data, as you have reasoning. So the RBL and IOM tool just turn early warning from an idea into a practical reality. And the third lesson that we can have is that a decision taken at one border cascade across several countries. So anticipation, dialogue, and early warning have to be designed at the regional scale. Not a single state can manage this alone. And so where do we go from here? The next frontier is not just collecting more data. It is just embedding this data-driving early warning into the regional institutional architecture. So concretely within the ECOWAS framework, so TTT alert can feed formal conflict prevention and early warning mechanism alongside what is already being done. So IBM role from this is just to be the interface, connecting what pastoral community experience on the ground with the institution that can really act regionally. So the goal is just to turn local alerts into regional decision, and this is really how data become peace. So finally, let me just close with this policy message. So the main lesson of the Mali-Mauritania crisis is that pastoral mobility, as we have seen, can no longer be managed blindly. And thanks to RDMIO and partnership and the TTT too, we can now turn movements that are too often perceived as a threat into strategic information for peace, resilience, and regional stability. So where some see herds on the move, we will just see data that allow us to anticipate crisis and build lasting solution. So thank you, and I look forward for the discussion about that. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Then I'm going to proceed with the presentation of IOM's section. First of all, thank you very much for having us here on the Data for Peace Conference 2026. These are the names of all the participants that will be joining us today, and that you've just seen a presentation by the Réseau Billital Maroobé, for which Monsieur Mark was here in representation of Blama Diallo, the coordinator. Now, myself, I am Louisa, and I am the regional thematic expert for data and research for IOM West Central Africa. And I will present to you a bit of the TTT regional report. This is a report that was published in January 2026, and that really highlights a very fruitful, I would say, cooperation with the Réseau Billital Maroobé. For that, thank you very much, Blama, and thank you very much, Mark, for all your help in implementing this tool, which we have spirited together since 2019. So as Mark was saying, cross-border transhumance it's a long-standing livelihood practice. It sustains millions of herders, millions of sedentary communities as well. However, it's going through an enormous pressure. Climate change, demographic pressure, growing insecurity, urbanization. These have intensified the competition for natural resources, namely water and green pastures. And this can drive a lot of tensions between, namely, pastoralists, transhumants themselves, and farmers, for instance. In severe cases, this can lead to displacement or even death. And it's in that sense that the DTM has deployed, DTM is the displacement tracking matrix by IOM, and we have deployed the TTT, so Transhumance Tracking Tool, in 14 countries, and it does 4 things, really. You can see it here. So we do a preliminary mapping beforehand to start things off, make sure where are the routes, where are the people, etc. And then there are 4 components. The flow monitoring, which basically counts people and their cattle. We have the early warning system, which is, I think, one of the most interesting sections that is able to really tell us when one of these possible conflicts is happening, and then the presences profile and individual surveys, which can cover different thematics. Overall, we've monitored almost 300 million animals across 6 countries, more than 140,000 herders, and have issued almost 15,000 alerts. This is an example of a map, for instance, of a northward migration period between some of the months in 2024, and you can really see the complexity of movements in the region. This is something that it happens 24/7, so of course our data coverage is not perfect, but the highlights from our most recent regional report highlight that we were able to monitor sheep, cattle, goats, transhumant herders, which are indeed in the majority men, 40%, but 18% are women and 42% are children, boys and girls under 18 years of age. We also have complementary surveys that tell us that although the majority, you see here, 93% maintain traditional routes, if there are changes to their routes, 55% of them were due to climate pressures or pasture, changes in green pasture. In Chad, for instance, 64% of the route changes were driven by these factors, which led to almost 14 additional days of travel, which is a lot, really. But then let's focus on the early warning system, which I believe is the most interesting component of the TTT. And here, what we have is we work with really an extensive network of community relays, and they are trained to, within 50 kilometers of any risk zone that is identified in the preliminary mapping, to try and be aware of 2 types of alerts. So if there's an unexpected movement, if it's early, if it's late, or if it's something that is massive and unexpected, that might create additional pressure, or events. And these relate to actual or pending conflicts, for instance, a farmer-herder tension that could lead to a conflictual event. We were able to gather almost 7,000 alerts in 7 countries in this latest report, and 5,700 of them alone were in Nigeria, which is massive. You see here that 27% of these events caused casualties or injuries, even though only 3% caused actual population displacement. But the fact that there are casualties or injuries is very, very significant. So then what is the part that leads us to action? And this is the programmatic end. After this event is signaled, what IOM does is we train, let's say, a community of people within each of the villages. They are made of transhumant groups, local farmers, breeders, national authorities, community leaders. They are the ones that are going to implement community dialogue, some sort of mediation mechanism. The objective here is to try that the conflict doesn't escalate and that we are able to calm and ease tensions before it is raised to formal authorities. If needed, that is also foreseen, and they can have a legal and administrative response with the authorities. But the objective here is really to ease the tensions before they escalate. As you see, the resolution percentages really vary by country. And this, of course, really depends on the strength of these community mechanisms, on the presence of these local groups or not in each of these countries. And it's even more than countries, the location themselves. So you see how they greatly differ. But look, overall in the region, you see here on the right, we have a 56% resolution rate, which it's not perfect, but I do think that it's something that is significant and useful. The key findings that we have is that I'd like to highlight is that climate change is really reshaping pastoral mobility, as seen before in the data that I already highlighted from Chad, that we see that security crises really do displace these pastoral communities. For instance, in 2024, we saw that in Côte d'Ivoire, 98% of these cross-border herders came from Burkina Faso, and this was because of security reasons. And the most effective mechanism that we have to be able to ease these tensions are these local governance and community leaders. They are really essential to the resolution of conflicts. And sometimes, exactly because of these conflict and security issues in some of these countries, they're just not there anymore. So, of course, then they're not able to mediate and conflicts remain unresolved and they escalate further. For us going forward, what we'd like to do is to expand the TTT coverage, to increase flow monitoring points, to strengthen the data sharing that we have, and to increase the inclusion of women and local leaders in the TT activities. We'd love, and this is why we have invited other panel members, to anchor these early warning tools in institutional frameworks, for instance, from ECOWAS for long-term sustainability. You have a whole report here. And thank you. That's it from me. I will stop sharing my screen and now give the floor to Madame Hindu.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation first. And thank you also for the presentation, both of you, Mark and Luisa, on the fact at the regional level that you give. Yeah, so personally, I'm coming from a pastoral community. As she said, my name is Hindu Mor Ibrahim. I'm coming from a Bororo pastoralist peoples. So my people live in 6 countries: Chad, Cameroon, Nigeria, Central African Republic, and even to Sudan. So of course, before the colonization that they come and decide in Berlin, cutting our country into the pieces, it used to be our land. And when I say that my community, I'm saying that my own family. So I have my uncle, my cousin who have all these different 6 nationalities. And I get born in Chad, then I have the Chadian nationality. So just to give you the idea about the land that pastoralists are living around. The second fact that I wanted to share with you, I think you all know pastoralist is not a problem, it is a solution. And I appreciate Mark also said that. So we are contributing in the economy in all the sub-regional level. And in Chad alone, it's between 20 and 28% of the national GDP are built by the pastoralists. And actually, there is no a development of the industrialized way of the transformations of the pastoralists. This is just the original way of having the economy turning that is making all this GDP. And when we come to the regional level, it's up to 40%. And I did actually a report on that for the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that's showing how it is important to see the contributions of the pastoralists. But however, with all the climate change impact, biodiversity loss, we have the land degradation. So it's becoming a huge problem for the communities that are living and depending from the nature, because we still have our communities that living as a nomadic peoples and moving from one place to another one. So when the natural resources shrink, and then it's adding with all the catastrophe from the flood to the drought that's happening, and you all remember we had more than 10 people died. We have hundreds of people that died, hundreds of disappeared, and hundreds and thousands of cattle that also died. And every resources that are tiring to another one, and it's still to today, like many people, is still homeless. That also affect directly the pastoralists and the pastoralist way of life, the movement. So all the shrinking resources create the impact of conflict between the communities that are fighting each other to the remaining resources that are there. And you have the examples concrete on of the lake Chad, where you have like the Boko Haram that take it over from all the communities, and now the Nigerian side is completely the way that community cannot live, because my people around Lake Chad used to cross the lake to go to the Nigerian side during the dry season, and they come back. They cannot do that anymore. And now we have like the Niger peoples who are around the Lake Chad, and we have our people who can go to the DRC and come back. So all those impact are creating by the climate change, biodiversity loss, and then it's impacting the movement of the communities and the route of the migration. I'm not talking about the international migration, which is very sad for developed countries, but there is internal migration where men have to leave their communities either periodically because during the drought they have to leave and leave the women behind alone, or either they have to leave and go very far across countries to look for the better future. And at that time, women and children are left behind alone. So from all that, my organization, we call it Indigenous Women and People Association of Chad, that we're celebrating now 20 years of our work. So focus on how we can resolve those issues, but by combining the human rights, indigenous people rights, and environment protections, because for the pastoral communities, those two are inseparable. So in those programs, I'm going to share with you swiftly one examples that help us to mitigate the conflict between the communities. So we use the traditional knowledge of the communities and the science and technology. So I use the satellite image where for now we map it over 500,000 hectares. So that means 5,000 kilometers square. So the last one we did is around Lake Chad, where we have mapped 3,500 kilometers squares with 5,056 community leaders, that mean villages, island around Lake Chad, and pastoral communities is stopping point. So thousands of communities that come around, and when we did the map, it's helped us to delimit the corridor of movement of the communities, like the pastoralist road that are linked to the water. And then you have the fisher peoples, you have the agriculture people. So it's helped us to give the pastoral women land right for the first time in the history. And I'm so proud of that, because it's helped for those who are semi-nomadic to create an agroecology that help the children to go to school, because they use the money to create a community school that will help them to have in some villages. And then it's helped to have the food security, because during the dry season they can have the veggie that they can eat and they can sell for the first time. Otherwise, being a nomadic, it's also drying up all what people harvest during the rainy season and have eating them during the dry season, like 9 months, of course, with the milk and the rest of the stuff. So it's helped to give them a right. Right now, where I'm talking in Chad, there is a big consultation happening. People from my organization are there to restore the pastoral code that have been revised, if you remember, in 2015. So Chad have one law that call it the law number 4 of 1958 during the colonial time. This is the only one that worked. So in 2015, there was revisions of this law, and it have been rejected. And right now, so there is this consultation is happening to see how they can reactivate this pastoral code in order to help the delimitation of the corridors and mitigate this conflict. And talking about the conflict, the past 2 years, Chad faced it like a big conflict where many communities kill it. And in my own community, we have 43 people that get murdered, and even the baby of 2 weeks, just to tell you how cruel the conflict between the communities can happen. So through all that, we are hoping the pastoral code will be adopted. We are hoping that the project we are working on, it must be scaled, and it's not a hope, it is no negotiation. We need that. Like this project is helping the community to talk together. demarcate the land, mitigate the conflict, be a solution for climate change. It involves women use the traditional knowledge of the communities. So we need to invest on those kind of the solution. Money is there. We talk internationally and we know there is money there. So how we can use this money to the right community. And for that, we need a clear pathway for this direct access finance for the communities. And we need to change the financial system that can adapt to the communities. Then we do not ask the community to adapt to the finance. There are so many reports out. We don't want to do a community report again. We wanted to do the implementation on the ground, and implementation on the ground need the trust base to be happen. So this is what I really would like to share with you, and I hope that this webinar cannot end as a checking box also in another webinar. It can help us to see how we can help to create right policies, ensure the finance go to the communities, and then we can reopen all the natural resources to be shared among the communities, but also protect it to the next generation. This year is the International Year of Rangeland and Pastoralist, and we must use this opportunity to see how we can make it a decade of the pastoralist and how we can turn pastoralists as victim or as beneficiary to become a partner and a solution for all what is happening. And the International Migration Organization know what I'm talking about around the region. We are very happy to see how we can collaborate on that and making it a reality. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you immensely. That was wonderful to hear. And thank you for your intervention. I would now give the floor. I think we have a problem with the name that is displayed here. So I would kindly, okay, perfect, Dr. Hizagi. Yes. Your name is still displayed as Sofna. So we were not sure exactly. Yes, I'm sorry. Perfect.
It
Wonderful.
was the link that put Sofna's name in place of mine, but no problem.
Indeed. Perfect. So thank you very much. And over to you, please.
I'm going to try
the name
and
has
share
been
my
corrected.
screen.
Yes, I believe so. Please go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So thanks to all my colleagues, the previous speakers. So I'm carrying on from where they left off and talking about pastoralism and transhumance and in this case, rural conflicts in Nigeria. So Nigeria has one of the highest levels of violent conflict in West Africa, and much of that is attributed, rightly or wrongly, to conflicts between, for example, pastoralists and farmers. But I will try to problematize the categorization and analysis of some of this rural insecurity in Nigeria. So, first of all, the data sources show increasing levels of violent conflict and violent crime in most parts of Nigeria over the past decade. This does vary to some extent between states, but there's generally been an upward trend. I haven't presented the actual figures here, I'm afraid, but that's coming from ACLED and other sources. ACLED is the most widely used data source, but I would argue that there's often a limitation in the data that is used, because much ACLED data is from media reporting, newspapers, and so forth. So what is very important is to supplement that with empirical data from the field, where possible, where that can be obtained, whether it's from civil society associations, through direct field work, which I've been doing on this subject now for 2 decades, actually, and other sources. So there's generally an underreporting of data of violent conflict and its impacts in Nigeria, especially in the rural areas. The other issue, apart from the kind of comprehensiveness of the data, is the way that violent incidents are categorized in Nigeria, and probably not just in Nigeria. Maybe that's a general issue. So the public discourse and academic and policy analysis is sometimes very imprecise or problematic in the way that violence is actually labeled. I'll come back to that issue. So here we have a political map of Nigeria showing the 36 states, international boundaries, main water bodies. And what I would like to point out is that pastoralism, say a century ago, was concentrated in the top third of the country, but over time, more and more herders have spread southwards, but there's still a heavy concentration of pastoralists in the north as well. So it's not just a transfer south; it's a gradual migratory drift southwards. So the area under pastoral production has increased, and that's increased contact between farmers and pastoralists. And there are various reasons for this, including vegetation change, improved veterinary services, and the opening up of political space through state formation. These are the pastoral zones. This is very broad. I mean, botanically, of course, you can get much finer grained maps, which look at the different types of vegetation in these zones. And also this map does not cover the land cover and land use change. The point here is that changes in the distribution of pastoralists and of transhumants are closely linked to the vegetation. And this is where climate change comes in. But very importantly also is the expansion of cultivation and of farming. So as, for example, the humid tropical wet forests in the south have been degraded and cut down, you get derived savanna, which is more suitable for pastoralists, and that has increased their movement southwards. So these general trends in vegetation and deforestation and expanding cultivation have had a significant influence on increasing contact between herders raising cattle and sheep and so on, and farmers. Now, this is a particular case study. It's the largest protected area in Nigeria. It's a very remarkable conservation area called Gashaka Gumti National Park. It's 6,000 square kilometers, and it's right on the border with Cameroon along what's called the Cameroon Volcanic Line. So it's a mountainous area. Now, because of land pressure throughout the rural northern Nigeria and insecurity, there is growing pressure on conservation areas from farmers and also particularly from pastoralists coming in with their cattle, competing with wildlife and coming into conflict with rangers. So this is a project I've been working on. There are many assumptions about where the herders were coming from, but with ethnographic data and participatory mapping, we found that actually most of them are from the northeastern region. There were lots of wilder claims that they're coming from Mali and Niger and so on. The main cross-border route into Gashaka Gumti was actually from Cameroon, but a large percentage of the cattle come into the park are from the areas immediately surrounding the park, and then in the dry season from other parts of mainly northeastern Nigeria. So with this kind of data, we can start trying to find alternative grazing areas for pastoralists so they don't enter in such large numbers into the national park, and then address some of the core issues which are land use pressures and things outside the park. But this is an example of where data is needed to know who are the herders coming, where are they coming from, what are the pressures they're facing, why are they coming into the park. So that was a useful exercise. Now, when it comes to armed conflict in rural Nigeria, one of the problems is the categorization of these armed groups as Fulani militants. They're always labeled, or very often labeled, Fulani militants. And this has actually come into the global policy discourse. Now, it's true that the majority of pastoralists, but not all, in Nigeria are Fulani, and indeed in West and Central Africa. But there are other groups, like we were just hearing about Chad. There's a diversity of pastoral groups in the Chad Basin, for example, have Shua Arab and many others. But more broadly, Fulani are also victims of conflict. It's a population in the millions, and I think the ethnic labeling in this way is very one-sided. And it also comes back to the data, because the implication is that it's always the herders perpetrating violence. There's an underreporting of violence against herding communities. And so you end up with a very skewed data set, and conflicts which may be inter-ethnic in nature or political or over land get labeled as terrorism. So until recently, for example, the Global Terrorism Index, published by the Institute for Economics and Peace, had Fulani militants as one of the top 5 terrorist groups in the world, alongside Boko Haram and ISIS and Al-Shabaab and so on, which it seems they may have corrected that in the current report. But this kind of labeling has arguably exacerbated ethnic violence. So my point here is that the data is important, data for peace, but how do we analyze the data? How do we label the kinds of violent incidents, or how do we use the data that we're collecting? So I think that needs careful consideration. Much of one important part of the security crisis now in Nigeria, emanating actually from the Northwest, is linked to banditry. Now, it is true that a high percentage of members of some of these bandit gangs are Fulani. They're from particular clans in the Northwest, particularly from Zamfara and Katsina. But their victims are also very often other pastoralists who are also happen to be Fulani. So again, the ethnic labeling is not actually that helpful. And this is also kind of leading to social divisions in Nigeria. People are very surprised when I talk about my research findings in central Nigeria, for example. There's been some movement of bandits from the Northwest into parts of central and northeast Nigeria. We find that, yes, many of these violent criminals came from Zamfara, Katsina, and other places, but the main targets in the central axis are pastoralists. They're stealing their cattle, they're kidnapping for ransom. People then have to sell their herds to pay these huge ransoms. And they're also running into conflict with farmers. So using ethnic labels, I think, in these West African conflicts is problematic, and I think it's led to a lot of state violence against pastoral communities, especially Fulani, which makes the conflicts harder to resolve. And when we come to transhumance, and I think the IOM reports are very useful in this respect, the Transhumance Tracking Matrix, they are trying to facilitate peaceful transhumance. That's the idea of the data. And that's very important, because it's not always the act of mobility that leads to conflict. It's the conditions in which, say, mobile herding groups find themselves when they're moving. So blocked transhumance routes, the stock routes, which are supposed to be gazetted or kept open. And then, for example, the cultivation of grazing areas. So there's a question of how the data can be used to make sure that the conditions for peaceful transhumance are met, so that grazing areas are kept open. There's an agreement between farmers and herders over the timing of transhumance, and so on. The last point is that there's a very dominant perception in Nigeria, at least, that a lot of the herders who are either victims or involved or actually perpetrating armed conflict are from outside of the country, from typically Niger or Chad or Mali and so on, even Cameroon. But the reality, according to my own research findings and data in the border areas and also in central Nigeria, is that that's far from true. Most of the rural conflicts in Nigeria involve Nigerians. There's no huge influx from outside that is driving these conflicts, and there is cross-border transhumance, but it goes in both directions. And there's a large-scale movement of pastoralists from Nigeria into Central Africa because there's a lower population density in Central African countries. There's more land available. And there's also a wet season transhumance from the far north of Nigeria into Niger, and then a southwards return migration during the dry season. So I think this is the other point with the data. It has to be obtained from reliable sources, and preferably from the pastoralists who are actually moving, not from hearsay. So the sources of the data, and not always actually the sheer number of respondents, is very important. And then direct observation at the borders and so forth. And then you get a more complete picture. So those are really the main points I wanted to make in the presentation. But I will be very happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would give the floor now to Sokhna briefly to make sure that we cover everyone that should have been at the panel. Unfortunately, our representative from ECOWAS, Dr. Ombuka, wasn't available to join us today, but we would still like to make a very brief point on what she wanted to say. Sokhna, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? If someone...
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. So yeah, I just address a few points from IOM perspective on the importance of data from community level to regional bodies before the Q&A. I'll be quick. Just as we've heard, like one important lesson from the TTT for us is that for the Transhumance Tracking Tool, is that data is most effective when it's produced with communities rather than merely about them. As Madame Indu Maroobé Ibrahim mentioned, pastoralists, they are not simply the beneficiaries of data systems, they are the active contributors to them, and this inclusion is really essential so the mechanism works. Also, as presented by Marc Fiogbe, the Transhumance Tracking Tool was developed through a partnership between IOM and the Réseau Billital Maroobé, which is the largest regional network of pastoral organizations in West and Central Africa. And this partnership really reflects the fundamental principle for us, that is that local knowledge and community ownership are essential for effective early warning and conflict prevention. It ensures that data reflects live community realities, that alerts reach local actors in actionable formats, and that data is shared to herders themselves to take action. So those are principles that are really implemented during the TTT. We collect the data with the pastoral organization, with herders. We develop the tool, the forms with them, and then we share the information at local level and at higher level, like national or regional level as well. It provides the data collected, it provides the visibility from and to the communities whose realities are very often insufficiently reflected in national information system, as it was mentioned before. And it's also important to work with the organization, the pastoral organization, and the herders to ensure that wording and labels used are correct. And I understand from Dr. Igazi that we might have remaining work to pursue there as well. Data also plays a critical role in ensuring that the voices of women and indigenous people are included in peace-building processes. Women are often central actors in natural resource management, conflict mediation, and community resilience. Yet their perspectives, they are frequently underrepresented in formal decision-making structures. So by strengthening their participation in early warning system and local governance mechanism, this is not only a matter of inclusion, but also of effectiveness. And this is something we try to do, even though, I mean, if we want to be very honest, it's sometimes this is not a perfect realization so far. But I think that this is important, and we need to reflect what is lived by the communities, all the members of the communities. The experience of the TTT further demonstrate that local data systems, they can support regional governance. Pastoral mobility is cross-regional. Herders cross administrative and national borders in search for water and pasture. As a result, local tensions can rapidly become regional issues. And it's not because of pastoralists. This is because of the world conditions, just as the Dr. Igazi said. This is why the regional frameworks, such as the ECOWAS Transhumance Protocol, are so important. They provide the institutional foundation needed to transform local information into coordinated regional action to make sure that data is informing people who are doing the policies as well. So of course, the next step is to strengthen interoperability between local, national, and regional systems. Data should flow not only from communities to decision maker, but then also back to communities in forms that they can have access to and that can make it actionable. This is why we are implementing the TTT. We also support the development of dialogue platforms. And finally, I would just mention that IOM engage at 3 different levels. So we work at local level, as it was mentioned before. We try to strengthen conflict management committees, community dialogue platforms, local conflict resolution mechanism. We act also at national level, supporting state technical services to integrate TTT data and to collect the data as well. And we work at regional level, trying to advocate for the institutionalization of early warning mechanism and flow monitoring mechanism as well. The normative framework exists, as I said, the Transhumance Protocol, the JAMENA Declaration, but what is missing is a harmonized regional data system and real-time cross-border sharing mechanism. Again, as previous speakers already stated, the UN designated International Year of Pastoralism and Pastoralist offers a very unique diplomatic window to anchor the rights of herders in national and regional regulate frameworks, and to show support to pastoral mobility. This is just what I wanted to say before giving the floor to Luisa. Thank you very much.
Thank you immensely, Safna. That is perfect. I see that we have 6 minutes left, so that's not a lot of time, but I wanted to ask if there are any questions. I saw something in the chat from Sophia, which I already replied to, about the Central African Republic and the TTT there. I replied, but I'm not sure. I think she only sent it to me. So I'm shared our regional TTT report, in which you can see the countries in which it is active or was active in the past. In the Central African Republic, this is one in which it was active in the past, and IOM being projectized, it really depends on the funds that each mission gets. That's what's going to make it such that a country is able to implement it or not. So we hopefully will receive funds in the future. And in the meantime, I also shared our DTM link so that you could find previous reports, for instance. So that was the only question that I saw on the chat, at least from my end. But please, if there are Any other questions? We would be very, very happy to take them. Okay, I see another question in the chat. The link to the report is not working, it seems. Oh, that's weird. I will share it again just in the chat generally to try and see if that center hosts and panelists. So this is the link to the report. I hope it's working now. At least it seems to be. And I see another question. Let's see. Thank you to the panel. We've seen how this tool effectively tracks pastoral mobility, but my question is about the entire chain of action. How do you blend modern GPS tracking with the traditional knowledge of local herders on the ground, ensure that data stays accurate in areas with poor cell service, and ultimately convince regional governments to act on these alerts before violence breakouts? Very complex question. That has several levels of answer, I would say. How do we make sure that the data is accurate in areas with poor cell service? That is why there's flexibility with our network of community relays for them to track the information themselves, even if they don't have access to the network at the moment of collecting the data itself. But once they have connectivity again, they can then insert it into Kobo, for instance. On your question about incorporating modern GPS tracking, that's something that we do as well a lot. Again, with the Kobo, you can track direct GPS coordinates, but we've even had more, I would say, complex initiatives of doing satellite imagery, using satellite imagery to try and track where the herders and their livestock were moving through. So that's something that we are also trying to integrate as well. And then convincing regional governments to act on these alerts, that is the most difficult one for sure. We act with the ZTT much more at the local level, for sure, with local governments. And then it's a lot about sensitization and awareness building with the national and regional institutions, which is why ECOWAS is such an important partner for us. Transhumance, luckily, is high on the agenda for the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and UN institutions. So this is something that all of them work towards, but work in progress. Definitely not something that is that easy to implement. I hope I've answered everything.
Louisa, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Does the Transhumance Tracking Tool distinguish between different types of transhumance? Because obviously there's sometimes transhumance within a local area, like the herds might just move, say 20, 30 kilometers. Then there's the longer distance transhumance seasonally between, say, wet season and dry season pastures. Then there's permanent migration from one place to another, which is not really transhumance, but it involves the movement of large herds, maybe from one country to another permanently, like from Nigeria into the Central African Republic. We documented that a lot. So do you capture these differences? Because I think that's important as well.
Absolutely. It's something that I'd say we definitely focus much more on the second one. The seasonal migration patterns is the one that at least the TTT is more focused on. Safna, please go ahead if you have any details, maybe on the surveys. I don't know if we would have any data on the other two more temporary or permanent types, but not that I'm aware of, but please go ahead.
So I would say no, we are not distinguishing the permanent one, but we make sure when we do the interview that we are not asking questions to just herders going to the market, for instance, and we make sure to distinguish between internal movements and cross-border movements. So, and we are also asking where they were coming, where they intend to go as well in the flow monitoring. So we are able then in the data analysis to make the distinction. There's also a question on if the data is publicly available for RBM. So I can say that yes, they publish reports, but maybe Mark, if he's still here, can answer the question. As for IOM, we have all of our reports online on our displacement tracking metrics website, so dtm.iom.int, I think, if I'm not wrong, sorry. But this is all online, as well as the report that was shared by Louisa. And so you know where, as I was saying before, you know from where the movement were coming and where they intend to go. So you have the whole image.